afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Chekow-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL expands the Rochester Public Library's community impact through fundraising, marketing, and programming. We also provide supplemental materials support to libraries in 8 counties through restricted funds. Welcome to Tuesday Topics, one of FFRPL's legacy programs. Our Winter 2025 series will highlight a few of the director's favorite things. We are live streaming the formal portion of today's program to the library's YouTube channel. If you're looking to access the induction loop service in this auditorium, please adjust your hearing aid to the T switch. In honor of Patty Uttaro, Director of the Monroe County Library System and the Rochester Public Library, FFRPL's Winter Tuesday Topics series showcases 4 special projects and areas which she selected. Patty retires in February after a career dedicated to the library. Mayor Evans says, Patty has been an exceptional leader of one of our most critical community resources for 16 years, and she will be sorely missed. Patty has been a model public servant, ensuring that our libraries remained rich resource centers of engagement, lifelong learning, and access. In lieu of retirement gifts, please consider donating to the Harold Hacker Fund for the Advancement of Libraries in Patty's honor. The fund supports grants for innovative projects and programs and professional development to eligible regional libraries. You can make a gift in Patty's honor at ffrpl.org. We are delighted to have Patty launch our series today with a talk about Central Library's signature juried Art of the Book and Paper exhibit. The exhibit was Patty's idea, initially held in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Rochester Public Library in 2011. The show has grown to include work from around the world. FFRPL is proud to be a founding sponsor of Art of the Book and Paper. Our organization is also proud and grateful to have had the opportunity to partner with Patty on Art of the Book and Paper, as well as many other impactful community projects throughout her tenure at the library. Please join me in welcoming Patty to the podium.
Thank you for that very nice introduction and welcome. Susan's right. When in 2010, when we were starting to talk about what to do for the library's centennial, as you can imagine, there were a lot of ideas. I know there were a couple people in the audience who were involved with that, and I kept coming back to the idea of the book. We talked a lot about why the library existed, why was the library formed so many years and years ago, not just Rochester Public Library, but other libraries in Monroe County. Monroe County has a pretty rich history, very early history of forming libraries. Some of our libraries in this county are more than 200 years old. I tell this story often, so some of you may have heard it, so forgive me. But many years ago, when I was doing a book for the Ogden Library in the Spencerport community, I was doing research on that and discovered that the first 3 formal organizations that were formed when the town of Ogden was settled in the early 1800s were a school, a church, and a library. And at the time, and I still think this, I think that says a lot about the people who settled this region. Because at the time that the Ogden Library was being formed, there were also libraries being formed in Pittsford and in Scottsville. Those are the other 2 really old libraries within Monroe County. But what made that happen? You know, why would you, as a group of pioneers, literally cutting your way west from Connecticut and Massachusetts, what would make you form a library when you got here? You know, think about that for a minute. These are people who had very few resources. Imagine how precious books were that they carried with them across New York State. And that, at the time, got me thinking about what makes books so special. And in preparation for this talk today, I posed that question to my Facebook friends. What makes books special? So I'm going to ask that of you today. In your opinion, what makes a book special? Anybody want to share that? Yeah. Transport. What a great word. And in nearly every response that I got on Facebook, people use that word, right? So I'm going to read you some of those responses. Letitia Doucette, who's a local activist, wrote, "The ability to explore different works and characters, you get to just be transported and immersed in other worlds." My friend Jennifer Kowazik, who's a school librarian in Indiana, wrote, "Books transport us to new places, adventures, and lives." Lauren Marie, who is a substitute librarian here and is someone who worked for me at the Ogden Library as a page and then became a librarian, wrote that books make you feel acknowledged, like someone can really see you, and it can make you feel less alone in your feelings. That's a pretty powerful statement, right? Kathy Wolf from the Winton branch wrote that books allow you to identify with characters and live vicariously through their eyes, which in some cases means seeing myself, and in other cases means seeing the world through a different perspective. Kim Arachi, who's the director of the Williamson Library to our east, wrote, "Being able to immerse yourself as an observer in a story that either reflects your life or a story so different that either way you learn, empathize, and better understand the choices people make, lives that are lived, and how our experiences shape us." And finally, Rachel Payne, who's the director of Children's Services for the Brooklyn Public Library System, wrote, "When I am haunted by a book after I finish it, the characters, plot, imagery, setting, and ideas stay with me, and I continue to think about them, and they change my perspective." Right. So lots of different words were repeated there. Immerse, different, transport. Those are the things that make books magical, right? They allow us to immerse ourselves in another world. And as we were talking about the centennial of the Rochester Public Library, there were a lot of interesting big ideas that were proposed at the time. But I kept coming back to why libraries exist. And that kept me coming back to the book. The book as an object, the book as a vehicle to transfer ideas, but especially the idea of the book as an object, right? Anyone who's worked in libraries for a while, and I see a couple people here, know that books themselves, the items, the thing, have become almost sacred, and in many ways are sacred to people in sometimes understandable ways and sometimes in ways that make us go, oh, come on, right? People have a really difficult time understanding that libraries actually do throw books away, right? Many, many years ago, we had an incident where our facilities manager had our dumpster, our post-book sale dumpster, delivered to South Avenue, right in front of the library, instead of back here in the parking lot where nobody could see it. And that dumpster was literally filled to the top with books. We were at the time undergoing a renovation of both the Rundle building and this building, and the literature division was consolidating to allow the arts division to move across the street. So they were having to get rid of a lot of old reference books that nobody looked at anymore. Things like Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. Who remembers those big green books, right? You all use them in your school library. That was the only way you could find a magazine article back then. But we had issues of that going back 40 years. Giving information about how to find a magazine article from literally 40 years ago. And so those are the things that ended up in that dumpster. And people became utterly incensed by that, right? We had Channel 8 in front of the library with their cameras as people were climbing into this dumpster. And looking at the things that were in there, people were actually taking those Reader's Guide books. No idea what they were going to do with them, but I suspect that there might have been some artists in that group of people who were pulling these old things out of that dumpster. And, and that led us again to this whole concept of the art of the book. I'm sure you've all seen books that you truly consider works of art. You may have seen them in museums, you may have seen them in libraries, you may have seen them here as part of this exhibit. But that's what we wanted to get into with this exhibit called Art of the Book. And initially in that first year, we had 3 categories. We had artist books, altered books, and illustration. I'm going to talk a little bit about those as we go through. And I had no idea at the time that this would become our signature exhibit, as Susan described it earlier, and touch people from across the world. We thought we might get maybe 20 submissions from local artists. And it's how we met Rachel, who was our local book artist, and a judge for Art of the Book for almost from the beginning, I think, right? Yeah. But, it brought new friends into the library, both locally and globally. So this is how it began. This was our first exhibit. I know, can we turn the lights down? This is a particularly dark slide, I'm sorry to say. But we held the first exhibit in what is now the Technology Center in the lower link level. That, quite honestly, was the only space that we had at the time. And it consisted of 2 of these cases. These are old card catalog cases, in case you don't recognize them. When the card catalogs were removed from the Central Library, our facilities manager, who is also a master carpenter, turned them into display cases. So, great reuse of iconic furniture there, and you'll see these all over the library. But that's how it began, 2 cases, and now it fills a good portion of the Rundle building. So how it's developed. We're going to go through just a few pictures here. I selected a few of my favorites, and we've found over the years that people interpret the call for entries in very different ways. So we have artist books, which are books created from scratch by an artist, where the artist is interpreting something. And we have altered books, which incorporate physical books, and they're altered in some way. So you can see in that lower image, that's a camera that was created out of the text of a book. I don't recall if it actually worked, but I think it did. It was created using plans from our local history division of an early camera. The other image next to it, it's a little hard to see, I know it's dark, but there's an artist book, just completely recreated. Well, actually that might be considered an altered book. But you also have various things that were hanging on the wall that actually led to the idea of adding paper as a category, where somebody has taken the basic components of a book and turned them into something very different. And then in the case, the picture with the case, you see, these were one of my favorites. These were made by Nancy Nugent, one of our librarians. Dresses made out of pages of books, where she created a pattern or used a pattern for these old-fashioned little dresses, made the patterns out of the pages of a book, and then hung them as if it's laundry to dry. I thought that was one of the most charming things that I've seen. Here's some more. Here's an atlas of the world reimagined into the shape of the world, right? Just very creative use of that particular book. And then a dress made out of pages of a phone book. You know, does anybody remember actually when we used to get those big, thick phone books? This was also made by a staff member, and I suspected she used a phone book that we discarded from the collection. She might have retrieved it from that dumpster, I don't know. But there you have it, you know, a beautiful dress that she could actually wear. And she did wear it at least once that I know of. But some other, you know, other examples there, where somebody's hollowed out a book and turned it into a jewelry box or a keepsake box. And other examples of how books have been revised or reimagined to become pieces of art versus just something that you read. One of my favorites is the Reader's Digest purse. Somebody used an old Reader's Digest condensed book and turned it into a purse, made a fashion statement. And these types of purses you can find now in very high-end boutiques. You know, I'm often amazed at what I see online because books are a thing, right? They're really a thing right now. Very popular on Book Talk, on TikTok, on Instagram, and there are artists who are making a living out of using images from books or altering books or creating books. The middle entry, you probably can't read the card, but it says woman's work. And the interior of that book was all related to women's work, all drawn into this one beautiful fan of a book. I don't know if you can see this entry right here. And Rachel, I'm sure you remember that one. That is a composition book made out of cloth and completely embroidered. So the front of the composition book, you've all seen the black and white composition books. The front of that, the cover of that, totally embroidered to look like that composition book. And the interior of that composition book consisted of embroidered pages of text. It was quite amazing. And if I recall, it took the artist over a year to create that piece. That was probably one of the most labor-intensive pieces that I've seen in this exhibit. And finally, this one was an entry in, I think, 2022. This was a local artist, and he created this out of paper to demonstrate and make a comment on the gun violence that was happening and continues to happen in the city of Rochester. If you can, I think you can see it. You can see the shell are body outlines, and inside that shell are guns. This was a signature piece that we put right out in front during this particular show, and caused quite a bit of commentary. I'm not sure if this won Best of Show, but it might have that year. So, you know, the show has been used to comment on what's happening in the world. And that actually happened very early on in our first couple of years of Art of the Book. And that led us to this. The Al-Mutanabbi Street starts here. Do any of you remember that exhibit? Dick, I know you do. We were contacted by a number of global book artists who wanted to know if we would host this very, very moving global exhibit, traveling exhibit. Al-Mutanabbi Street is the street of booksellers in Baghdad, Iraq. And it was bombed and destroyed. You can see a picture of that here in 2007. It has since been rebuilt. There's some interesting things online about those booksellers who helped rebuild that street. But some of those global artists who had been part of our show contacted our staff who were running it and said, we would really love to bring this show to Rochester because of the reputation you are building in the book arts community. So we had that exhibit here for a couple of months, and it consisted of some of the most moving examples of book art that I think I've ever seen. It went on to visit multiple other cities in the US, and we were fortunate to have some of those global artists here at our opening to talk about this exhibit and how important it was for artists to respond, book artists in particularly, to respond to this wholesale destruction of a street of booksellers in a country where information is so closely guarded. And that's one of the things that we've seen as a theme through some of the global entries that we received during the year is the concept of the power of books to include ideas that are different from your own. And the artists who participated in the Al-Mutanabbi exhibit talked about that in their pieces, about how you can bomb us, but you will not destroy us. That there will always be book artists and authors and poets who will record what they see and allow people to experience things other than what they know. And isn't that, after all, the power of books? You know, we heard it for early on today in how books transport us and allow us to see things through other people's eyes. It's been a constant reminder to us over the last couple of years as more and more libraries, school libraries, public libraries, are being targeted for book banning. Because when you have a very powerful argument and people in power who don't want you to understand and see that other point of view, the first thing they go after are the educators, the librarians, and the teachers. And we've seen that in our country to a point that is quite disturbing. But we've also seen some good things come out of that. The state of Arkansas earlier this year passed a law that made it criminal for librarians and teachers to provide certain books in their libraries. That law was just overturned in Arkansas. So, yay. But there is a library in one of the Dakotas, I don't remember if it's north or south, that no longer allows children to enter their library because, this is a public library, because of laws passed in that state that makes it a criminal offense if a child is exposed to something that their parent or guardian deems inappropriate in a public setting. So this particular library, a small, rather small library, their board of trustees said, then we just can't have kids in this library because we can't guarantee that your child will not be exposed to something that you find harmful. Imagine that, a library that doesn't allow children inside, right? because they might be exposed to something that their parents don't agree with. So I love this image. This is, some of you may have seen it before, but this is an art installation that I've seen online over and over and over again. I'm sorry I don't have the attribution for it, but I can find it if you're interested. But it's meant to show the impact of a book. And if you can see what this is, there's one book in the center of that brick wall at the bottom, and you can see what that does to that wall. It disrupts the entire wall. And I don't think I've seen a better visual representation of the power of a book, right? Has anybody seen this before? No? I have to find the attribution for this. I believe it was an artist in New York City who created this. But think about that, the power of one book to disrupt an entire brick wall. It's a pretty powerful image, right? So I wanted to share that today. And then talk a little bit more about what we've continued to do and what I've seen happen online regarding books. So the Horton Hears a Who. Anybody know what that's from? That was from our Edible Books Festival, right? We did that for a few years. That was one of the things that FFRPL, one of those crazy ideas that FFRPL agreed to fund and to produce for us. The Edible Books Festival is a national thing. It happens on, again, Shakespeare's birthday every year. And the concept is you invite people to create edible versions of books. So we held this contest for maybe 5 or 6 years, and Horton was one of the winners in the year that it was submitted. But we had people submit things like Horton, which were representational of storybooks or books. But we also had people submit book cakes or things that actually looked like books. Premier Pastry, one of our local bakeries that I think is closed now, but they submitted one year a stack of books that were actually cakes. So the whole idea of edible books was a lot of fun while it lasted, but then people just sort of lost interest, I think, in that. The middle image is one of my favorite things, and I will tell you something that I have considered doing in my retirement. So in Scotland's libraries, there has been a mysterious unknown book artist who has created these miniature sculptures out of books and then hidden them in various libraries. If you go online and search for Scotland book arts, you'll find the story. You'll find multiple stories on it. But this is a person who is creating these small things, these small sculptures out of books, and then adding them to library collections. Kind of fun, right? So if you see these starting to show up in MCLS libraries, it might be me. Might be me. I'm not going to say for sure. But I just love that idea. You know, it's such an interesting surprise when you're going through a library shelf. And then the book that has the greenery in it, in the top, that's one of the things that we considered for the North Terrace on the side of the Rundle Building. There's a piece of public art there, and we did an RFP process, and I was part of the team that selected the artist. We had over 60 submissions from artists from all over the world, and I will admit, I came down on the representational side. I really wanted to see something like this, or a representational piece of art that pointed to the library as a place that stores books, right? Very old-fashioned, I know, and I was voted down. But we ended up with a beautiful piece of public art that is representational in a way because the carvings on it represent all of the things that you can find in the library, including books. And the first Art of the Book exhibit also started sort of a flurry of installation of little free libraries throughout the city of Rochester. In fact, Dick, do you still have one? All right. So the staff who actually put on Art of the Book exhibit created a little free library that Mr. Hamilton had put in front of his house. You were president of the RPL board at the time, I think. But there was a young man named Ken Braley who started a group called the Snowball Effect. And he raised money to buy something like 40 of these pre-made little free libraries. And they went up all over the city of Rochester. He had this small group of people who were committed to finding stewards for all of these libraries. But we've also started to see really interesting ways that people incorporate the little free library concept. I like this example of using a dead tree stump, where people have cut out slots for books. Not sure how that works in weather, but I like the way it looks. And we've seen the concept of take a book, leave a book, expand to other things. Like the Arnett Library has a food pantry that operates on a similar idea to the little free library. It's, take what you need. And people in the neighborhood fill that for people who need it. That concept of sharing of information and then sharing of other things that people need, I think has been one of the really beautiful things that's come out of the whole Art of the Book concept. Here's a couple other things that have struck me over the years as I've watched online what people are doing with books. Artists especially. This picture over here looks pretty nasty, right? There are artists who want to see the effects of weather on books. So they create these sculptures and put them outside and leave them there over the course of a couple of years and then come back and see what they look like. This is an example of that. This is actually a garden in Paris, maybe? And these books have obviously been there for a while. One of the interesting things that we've talked about with different people over the years regarding altered books particularly is how can you encourage people to destroy books? That question has come up to me more than once. And, and I think that also applies here. People look at this and say, oh my gosh, how can you allow this to happen to books? And that's going back to that whole concept of the object as a sacred object, right? But looking at this pile of moldy, moss-covered books, I'm thinking there's a lot of textbooks in there, from what I can see. Books that people are probably not ever going to read again. The other image is from Toronto, and this is something that I think they've done a couple of years in a row. A group of artists there create a book or a river of books along one of their streets in Toronto, and they add lighting to it. It's really quite a striking thing to see when they do it. This image is a shortened image of the entire book river. If you go online and search for Toronto Book River, you'll find a number of images of this. It's really quite beautiful. And this is my last slide. And I always want to end with Malala. Let us pick up our books and pens. They're our most powerful weapons. And, she I'm sure many of you are familiar with Malala. She was shot in the face by Islamic extremists because she was a young girl attempting to go to school. And she turned that around into basically becoming an activist for the liberation of young women in in traditional Islamic countries. And she has become sort of the poster child for education and the power of books. And that's probably the primary thing that we wanted to get across with the Art of the Book exhibit. That yes, you can sit down and read a book and it can be a very powerful experience, but there are also other ways to look at books as an object and creating art with those books and what that art can tell you beyond the words that are contained within the book. Libraries themselves, I wanted to end with this. Libraries themselves, like everyone else, struggled during and after COVID. We were closed for almost a year, but people still came to the library to pick up things curbside. It was still important that that first week of the COVID lockdown, our phones never stopped ringing with people. Cynthia Dana remembers, she was here for that. People wanting to make sure that they had what they needed from the library. Piles and piles of picture books for kids. Stacks of James Patterson books for people who didn't know when they were going to get out again. But as we recovered from that pandemic, one of the things that we struggled with was a sea change, really, in how people viewed the library. Something that we anticipated and worried about a lot was our borrowing process. Are people going to want to continue to borrow from the library, borrow materials from the library where they don't know who had them before? And what steps could we or should we take as library stewards to make sure that those collections are safe? And I can tell you, we wiped down a lot of books early on. But in the last couple of years, we've started to see library use rebound. So in 2024, countywide, there were 6.3 million items borrowed through our libraries. Think about that, 6.3 million items in a county of about 740,000 people. It's a lot of materials, right? And that was up from 2023 by almost 1 million items. So people are coming back. And if you look behind our circulation desk today, you'll see the results of that in a huge shelving backlog, which we haven't had in a very long time. And I was talking with the circulation supervisor a little while ago. He said, this makes me happy because this tells me visually that people are back, right? That our patrons are back. So we continue to see the book as this sacred object, but for our libraries, that's important. But for our libraries, we also continue to make available those ideas and experiences that are new to you. And that, in a way, is just as important as the object, right? I'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you have. We've brought over some examples of past entries in the Art of the Book competition. We've had a number of artists over the years who have elected to donate their entry. So we have a small gallery in the third floor lobby of the Rundle building, if you ever want to head over there and take a look. The best of show winner from the very first show is over there. is a piece by Scott McCarney, a well-recognized book artist. And it is a book that he bought at an Arnett Library book sale that was discarded by the library, and it's a waterfall. He took the book and cut the interior in such a way that the pages cascade down. It's probably about 8 feet tall, I would say. It's hanging from the ceiling. You know, Scott was a huge supporter of this program from the very beginning, and I think was probably partially responsible for our global aspect because he's so well known in the community. But these are some, Susan, I think you have that one in your office, right? Yep, yeah. And then there are several others across the street if you wanted to take the time today to go over and look at some of those. Are there any questions or comments